and she was appointed by Governor Bob McDonnell. We would ask that you keep your questions this evening. The floor will be hers for her to interact with you without any middleman or interference. But we would ask that you keep your questions specific to state issues. Without any further delay, Mrs. Jeannemarie Davis.
All right, I've got to tell you my pizza story. So we had a little meet and greet, and it turned out there was a minimum, and I owe you an entire pizza. Because
with meatballs.
you didn't eat. So I went to pay for our drinks, and they said, well, there's a $150 minimum. And I thought, well, if I'm going to pay $150, I'm going to buy food. So I decided I was just going to bring pizza over. So there are 10 pizzas there. I hope when we're finished, you'll help yourself. And if you're not hungry, then I'm just going to give the 10 pizzas to whoever comes to me first. So there you go. You're going to have to run fast. But it's terrific to be here. And I'm glad that I was here to listen to some of the issues that are important to you, because I've actually worked on some of them, like Common Core standards. And I can tell you a lot more about that as I'm talking. But first, I want to make it clear I am not an attorney. I have a degree in mathematics. I am a mathematician. I am not an attorney. There are an awful lot of attorneys in the General Assembly. The worst thing that happens is when you have legislation that you have to bring to the Courts of Justice Committee. Because Courts of Justice is all attorneys, and you spend forever there, as they spend 30 minutes deciding what the meaning of a word is, and whether it should stay in or out of your bill. So it's excruciatingly painful to go before all those attorneys anyway. But let me tell you a little about myself. I grew up in an Air Force family. We moved to Arlington when I was 10. I was in the 5th grade and in my 5th school. And my father was a civilian and left the Air Force to work for the FAA, so we wound up staying in Virginia. As I told you, I have a degree in mathematics from the University of Virginia. I was there in the early mid-70s. I was in the 5th class of women, so it was the first class where they had women in all 4 classes. And I'm the mother of 4 grown daughters who are 24 to 34. I like to tell people I thought I'd have at least 1 grandbaby by now, and I have none, so I'm a little bitter about that. And after I say that, people line up afterwards to show me pictures of their grandchildren, just rubbing a little salt in that wound. But one day, my second daughter was married a year and a half ago, and they just bought their first home, and so there may be light at the end of this tunnel. We'll see what happens. I started, as many of you did, I was a volunteer and a grassroots activist. I wanted to get involved in the Republican Party because I knew I was a conservative and that was the party for me. Actually sent a letter, this was pre-internet days, wrote a letter to the party chair in Fairfax County, told him I wanted to get involved, got no response. And this individual is Pat Mullins, our current RPV chair. So there you go. And I was volunteering in my daughter's library at school, and there was another mom there whose husband came in and started talking to her about the upcoming campaign and all of the volunteer work they were going to do. And so I approached her and said, what party are you affiliated with? And when she said Republican, I said, hallelujah, I think I finally found a way into this party. And next thing I knew, I was standing out in the freezing cold in front of Wolf Trap Elementary School, passing out literature for the Alan Ferris Gilmore ticket. So we all get started the same way. I became the magisterial district chairperson for my magisterial district in Fairfax County Providence District, which was the most Democrat district in Fairfax County. So we would go out on Saturdays, knocking on doors, looking for the 1 or 2 Republicans that we just knew lived in those precincts, and we would find them eventually, and even more. And then I decided that I would give it a try and run for office. And in 1997, I was elected to the House of Delegates, where I served for 3 terms. In my 3rd term, I was elected by my colleagues to serve as Majority Whip, and am the only woman in the history of the General Assembly to ever be elected into a leadership position. While I was in the House, I actually carried and we passed the very first voter ID bill. And this was back in 2000. So for the past 13 years, probably 12, it probably took a year to get it all initiated, but for the past 12 years we've been showing an ID at the polls because of the legislation that I passed. Now what was interesting is I tried to pass this legislation when I first got there, and we had 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans in the House. It was tied 50-50. And I had beat a Democrat incumbent, so I actually brought the State House to parity when I was elected to the House. And what would happen is the Democrats would use the Black Caucus and have them pop up one right after another, talking about how a voter ID was equivalent to a poll tax. And I would get up and say, you get a free voter registration card when you register to vote, and you can use that as an ID. And if you lose it, they'll send you another one for free. I just couldn't understand how they could equate one with the other. So in essence, the bill passed 52 to 48. All the Republicans voted for it. all the Democrats voted against it, and I wanted to put a little sign around all their necks, the Democrats, saying, I support voter fraud, because that in essence is what they were supporting. Now, back at that time, and it has improved since then, because obviously just was passed was photo ID, which was long in coming. So I'm very grateful they have found a way to do that. I think it will even tighten it up. The other issue that I had a concern about were these electronic voting machines. And so after I left the State House, I went to the State Senate, where I was the only Republican woman and the only pro-life woman. And so I was responsible for killing all the Planned Parenthood bills. And a lot of candidates will come before you and tell you they have an A with this group and an A with that group. Well, I am here to announce to you that I had a 0 with the National Organization for Women and a 0 with NARAL. So, you know, they always grade us women on, with, you know, associations like that. But while I was in the State Senate, I chaired a joint subcommittee to look at these electronic voting machines, the DREs, the touchscreen machines that currently a lot of folks in Virginia are using to vote. But at that time, everyone was using them. And what bothered me so much was there was not a verified paper trail. So what that meant was when you went to vote, you were making an assumption that the vote was being recorded in that machine the way you meant for it to. And yet we would hear stories from people saying that the screen that came up for me to say vote wasn't the same way that I had voted on the touch screen. So in this joint subcommittee, we met several times. We had technology experts come in, one man in particular who was really opposed to these machines, and he talked about everything that could go wrong with them. Also, the localities were totaling the votes in a precinct onto one master machine and then transmitting it wirelessly back to the local Board of Education, or Board of Elections. And what we understood was, if someone cared to, they could be out in the parking lot intercepting that. Now, of course, at some point, and altering the outcome. Although at some point you have a canvas and the numbers wouldn't match up. The problem is when you have a recount, and we have a member of the House of Delegates who's a Democrat, who won by 1 vote. He won his election by 1 vote. So every vote is so important, and the integrity of our voting process is so important. And I just couldn't sit and watch these machines being used where we just didn't know whether they were recording the votes properly. So what we wound up doing, my legislation was, when these DREs go by the wayside and need to be replaced, they have to be replaced by a Scantron machine, which means you're voting with a paper ballot, which goes right through that machine. But we have a paper ballot, and when there's a recount, those paper ballots are counted, and we have a verified voter receipt, if you will, on that paper ballot, which accurately reflects how you voted as an individual voter. And I think that that was very, very important legislation. You only need about 1 Scantron for every 2 or even 3 DREs because it's so quick. People can spread around the room and fill out their ballot and then just go and pop it right through that machine. So it helps the process work quicker, but once again, it's a voter-verified paper trail, something that I thought was very, very important. And I have heard reports and some concerns that some of these machines are kind of pre-recorded. Is it really possible that a precinct votes 100% for one candidate? Or 102% for a candidate? That's the kind of thing that's been happening with these machines here and there. So I'm really thrilled that I was able to put some integrity in the very equipment that we use for voting. And I served on privileges and elections in the House and in the Senate, so I did do a lot of election law, but I think those are the 2 really key ones that I did. After I left the State Senate, while I was in the Senate, and for the couple of years after I left, I was a principal in a small technology consulting firm. And so I'm part of that technology community in Northern Virginia. And when Governor McDonald was elected, he did ask me to serve in his cabinet, and I ran the Washington office. And I learned an awful lot in the Washington office. And I'm here to tell you, no matter how bad you think that this administration is, the Obama administration, it's worse than you think. There's a lot of information out there, but boy, I know so much more. And I want to talk about a couple of those items right now to kind of give you an understanding of what I did in the Washington office. And one of the most important areas that I worked in was in the education area with the Common Core standards. And so I don't know what's going on locally in schools, but I can tell you nationally what the President has been trying to do and how we stopped all of that as far as the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. I think you may all be familiar with this Race to the Top program. And what Race to the Top does is it redistributes money from states with Republican governors to states with Democrat governors. Generally speaking, that's what's happened with this money. The Obama administration was given billions of dollars for this Race to the Top program. In order for a state to apply for a Race to the Top grant, they have to subscribe to the Common Core standards. If you can't put that in your grant application, you don't qualify for a grant. So I talked to Governor McDonald because Governor Kane had already started the process. Fortunately, we elected Governor McDonald. I know you're mad at him about the transportation bill, but he did do some other things really well, and this is one of them. And I said, Governor, if you apply for Race to the Top grant money, you're going to have to comply with these Common Core standards. And he said, well, I don't support them. And I said, I understand. And so he made a decision not to apply for a grant. But billions of dollars were sent to states who won these grants, and our tax dollars that we paid in Virginia were redistributed to other states who were willing to embrace and accept Common Core. And I think that's wrong. Money should be distributed by formula always. So those of us who pay taxes into the system are having it returned to us proportionately to how we're paying it. And instead, Congress gave him this discretionary pot of money, and it was billions of dollars. Well, after he finished with the Race to the Top program in K through 12 education, he decided he needed an early education Race to the Top program for birth to age 5. Why he needs to have our newborns, I have no idea. But I think it had a lot to do with daycare and preschool and that sort of thing, getting the education started right away. There were 10 grants that were awarded in the Race to the Top program for early education. 9 of them went to states with Democrat governors. 1 went to a state with a Republican governor. And I think that one governor got it only because it made it look that it was a little bipartisan. But this is the kind of thing that I saw. And I'll tell you, Speaker Boehner has a liaison to the Republican governor's offices, and I used to give him lectures every time this happened about allowing this president to have dollars that he can distribute personally rather than using a funding formula, because it just gets redistributed, generally speaking, from some states to other states, mostly those that are friendly to him. And I saw this really great evidence in the Race to the Top program. Now, it's time for, well, it has been time for reauthorization for many bills for several years now. And of course, we have a Republican House and a Democrat Senate who can't agree on anything, so nothing's been getting through. And that might not be such a bad thing. They can't do any harm if they're not being very productive. But ESCA, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, is the reauthorization of the federal dollars to the states for K through 12 public education. And one of the items that was in here, again, was Common Core standards. And so many of us that represented Republican governors' offices went and met with committee staff repeatedly, both in the House and the Senate, and talked with them, both the Democrat and the Republican staff, about inserting Common Core into this reauthorization. Now, this is the bill that currently has No Child Left Behind. And I will tell you that No Child Left Behind will be removed from that legislation. I think they've universally decided that on both sides. But we talked about Common Core standards, and we met with them repeatedly, and the way I left it, it still hasn't been reauthorized, is that Common Core would not be included in that legislation, and instead, they will say that students, when they graduate, need to be either college or career ready. And that's much better language, because if Common Core were in there, the Federal Department of Education, in my opinion, would be dictating to states what to teach and how to teach it. And that is such an imposition on states' rights in the 10th Amendment. There are so many areas that we all know states need to be in control of. Their public school system is definitely one of them. And so the fact that that language will not be embedded, and it says college or career ready, means that the local school districts, the states, can decide what they're going to teach, what the curriculum is going to be, and it should rest with the states. It should not rest with the federal government. So I was really proud to have been able to work so hard on that, to talk with committee staff and to work with them on making sure that Common Core did not become the rule of the land, so to speak, in public education. And once again, I left in September to start running statewide, but that's where I left it when I left it with them. Another area that I worked in was workforce training and development. Our tax dollars are used for federal training, or for workforce training and development. And in the money that is sent to the states for that, that's federal tax money, 15% of it had been given to governors for them to use as they saw fit in their states. Different regions have higher unemployment than other regions, and what's good for one state doesn't necessarily fly for the other. And the governors are being fairly innovative with these dollars that were coming to their states. The Obama administration wanted to take 2/3 of that money, leaving only 5% for the governors, and the other 10% they got to distribute whichever way they wanted to. And so I worked very diligently on that, and the outcome, as of when I left in September, was they were splitting that in half, so the governors would get 12.5% or 10%, and the Obama would get 5%. But you're still going to see a redistribution of dollars. And that just drives me crazy, because our money shouldn't be sent to other states. We hear a lot and talk a lot about the redistribution of our personal income to those that are not working, but we never hear about the redistribution of dollars between states, and that's going on at the same time. I will give credit to Virginia Fox, who was a Republican congresswoman from North Carolina, in that Workforce Redevelopment Act, or in the bill that does all that workforce redevelopment. She consolidated 44 federal workforce programs into one. Now just imagine how much duplication there is when you can take one little item like workforce training and development and consolidate 44 programs into one. Just imagine how many other areas there are when you can do that kind of consolidation, or even greater. But that's one very small example of how out of control and huge this federal government is, and how much duplication there is. All these different agencies create these programs without even checking to see if they've already been developed in another agency, and you just see all this duplication, and that's a perfect example of that. So I'm glad that she took, it was a small step, but it was an important step, and I think it sets a good example for how Congress needs to be looking at the budget in total and all of these programs and consolidate wherever they can. I think maybe I'll just stop there and see if you have any, oh no, there's two more things I want to say. I lost track because I was really getting involved in all this federal stuff, and I know that's so important to all of you. I was looking at all of your signs there, and I think they're really great. It sends a message. They're thoughtful messages for people to read and really think about as they're driving down the road. What I'd like to tell people too when I'm talking about this lieutenant governor's race is there are two statutory obligations for the lieutenant governor. One, of course, is to preside over the state senate. And I will tell you that it's very important to have served in the legislature for a very important reason. The Senate has its own set of rules. And the minority party, in this case the Democrats, because we've got the Republican lieutenant governor, likes to use those rules and the strategy of the floor to take control of the floor and to try and win things, win the outcome of legislations in a manner that suits them rather than us. And so I do think it's important to have someone with the experience that understands how that floor works and how to navigate it. The second obligation of the governor is to stand ready to become governor if the governor should become incapacitated and unable to fulfill his responsibilities. And so one of the differentiations, I think, between me and the other 6 candidates is this. I'm the only candidate for lieutenant governor who has served in the legislature and in a leadership position and has served in the executive branch, where I understand what every department and agency is doing, how they overlap and integrate with one another. But most importantly, I've directed that Washington office for 3 years. And as you can see, really engaged in policy and on the Hill. And I understand what the federal government is doing and how it directly impacts states. Not just the unfunded federal mandates that we see coming to our states constantly, eating up so much of our budget, but also understanding how they're encroaching on 10th Amendment rights, how they're encroaching on states' rights. And I think that's very important to have that broad base of experience as a partner to Ken Cuccinelli, but certainly as someone that might have to step up to the plate. Second thing that I want to talk with you about very briefly is electability. I think we're all tired of working hard and losing elections. And so I want to tell you about Northern Virginia and why that's so difficult. First, I'd like to remind you that the district that I represented in Fairfax County had a 17-point Democrat generic. Only 25% of my constituents were Republicans. And yet I was elected 4 times, twice with 60% of the vote, even though I maintained a 100% pro-life voting record, and I voted for the marriage amendment, which failed in my district. But I managed to be reelected in spite of all of that. And part of the reason is this. First, I want you to understand that you cannot win statewide as a Republican candidate unless you win 45% of the vote or better in Northern Virginia. And in the rest of Virginia, we actually saw better outcomes in 2012 than we did in 2008. Many of our smaller, more rural counties actually had more Republican votes and a larger number of Republican votes and Democrat votes, and improved over the 4 years before, when Obama was on the ticket both times. Governor Romney lost Fairfax County by 120,000 votes, and he lost Northern Virginia by 200,000 votes. And it was too large a gap to overcome, even with a great performance in the rest of the state. We also lost in Rico County. We didn't do as well in Chesterfield as we normally do, nor did we in Virginia Beach. traditionally rock-solid Republican jurisdictions that are becoming more and more, less and less Republican or conservative. And part of the reason for that is the growing diversity of our voters. In Northern Virginia, ethnic minorities are 30% of the vote. So if you need to capture 45% or better, and 30% of your voters are ethnic minority, it is not statistically, as a mathematician, possible to win with that a good portion of the ethnic minority vote. And in Northern Virginia, that's basically Hispanic, Korean, and Vietnamese. We did worse with Asians than we did with Hispanics in this last election, and that surprised us because our Korean and Vietnamese voters had traditionally been Republicans. Now, part of the reason for that is because the ethnic minority voters, Hispanics and Asians in particular, were completely set aside and not reached out to. When I did my press tour in November, when I returned back to Northern Virginia, I went to El Tiempo Latino and I went to the Korea Times to talk and interview with them because I understood how important those voters were. And what I was told by both newspapers is that Obama and Kaine advertised in their papers every single day from Labor Day to Election Day. When they reached out to the Romney and Allen campaigns and asked if they would like to advertise, they said no. Same thing on the ethnic radio stations, and although these folks are American citizens and are voters, they still read their ethnic newspapers every single week, and they listen to their ethnic radio stations. And so in essence, they were bombarded with Obama and Kaine's name, and they never heard Romney or Allen, or saw them. And you know, they don't know the difference between the Republican and the Democrat Party, but what they do know is these two candidates paid a boatload of attention to them and engaged them in the election, and these two candidates didn't bother. And so when they went to vote, who are they going to vote for? The people that they're familiar with, or the candidates that they're not familiar with? Not really understanding the difference between the parties. Interestingly, after the election, a survey was done of Hispanic voters, and they were asked, are you liberal or conservative? And about 67 or so percent said, I'm a conservative. And they said, well, are you a Democrat or a Republican? And those same people, most of them said, I'm a Democrat. They don't know that conservatives vote Republican and that liberals vote Democrat. They have a lot of education to do. But it doesn't help when we totally ignore those voters, 30% of the voters in Northern Virginia, many of whom we have to capture in order to win. So I want to leave you with this. I have made it a great effort of my campaign to engage ethnic voters. And so I have filed between 500 and 600 ethnic minority voters to come to this convention on May 18th. Most of them are in Northern Virginia, but I have 50 East Asian Indians in Enrico County and some Black Republicans. And in Hampton Roads, I've engaged the Filipino community and some other Asians. And the Hampton Roads Black Caucus, the Republican members, are on board my campaign. And my goal was to file hundreds and hundreds of ethnic minority delegates to come to this convention. The reason that's so important is this. If they don't come to our join us in our nominating process, if they're not at the convention and warmly welcomed, then the way the Obama campaign was able to define Republicans as anti-ethnic minority, they used a worse term than that, I'm not going to use it, then we're not going to convince them to come back and be our voters. And so this was very important to me and something that I have worked on diligently to make sure that we can engage, reach out, and my hope is that they will then go back to their communities and talk to their relatives and their friends and neighbors and say, you know what, we're conservative, that Republican Party is a conservative party. We were warmly welcomed, and we need to rethink how we voted in this last election. And I think if we don't do that, and we lose these voters, we are never going to win an election in Northern Virginia, enough in Northern Virginia to win again. So I'm very proud of the effort of my campaign to do all of that. And I hope that any of you that are there at the convention will stop and say hello to them and say, thank you so much for being here. What can we do to help you understand that we are allies and that we really want you to join our party and to vote with us. So thank you so much for your time. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Folks?
Okay. I'm interested in Common Core, but let me ask you a question. Could you discuss the transportation bill, pros and cons?
Gotcha. I will readily say that had I been in the legislature, I would not have taken the same approach for transportation. But if I were in the legislature, we'd have the majority and we wouldn't have taken the same approach on transportation anyway. I'm hoping that everyone understands that our transportation budget is in bad shape. In our statute, we are required to move construction money to maintenance and operations money because maintenance and operations take priority. And in just 4 years, in 2017, there will be no construction money left because all of it will be put into maintenance operations. And after that, We'll have no construction money and not enough maintenance and operation to pave and to plow and to repave, to plow and mow the grass. And so I believe that something needed to be done in that regard. And then you've got the construction side of it, and this is what I actually did for the Northern Virginia Hampton Roads regions back in 2007. In Northern Virginia, we have $8.1 billion in construction need. It can take an hour and a half to go 10 or 12 miles in Northern Virginia. It is really, really bad up there. And because traffic is so bad, if you're a small business, let's say you're a florist and you have to deliver flowers, you have to hire more people and buy more trucks in order to get the same amount of deliveries done as you had to do half a dozen years ago. It's becoming very, very expensive to do business. People are always late for work because the traffic is so bad. And in Hampton Roads, there's, I think, between $3 and $4 billion. I haven't really committed that amount to memory. And so the question is what do you do? Well, back in 2007, I carried legislation that created a local option for Northern Virginia. The folks in Hampton Roads liked the idea, so they did similar legislation that wasn't exactly the same, but it worked for Hampton Roads. And what it did was it gave different revenue sources that you could look at, taxes and fees, and it allowed the local governments to choose which ones they wanted, and they got to keep half the money so that they could do local road projects, and then the rest went to an authority, not to raise taxes, but just to decide which regional projects were going to be funded. Unfortunately, Governor Kane had a private meeting with the mayors and chairs in Northern Virginia, and they said, we don't like this, we want you to find another way. And so he decided to have those authorities do all of the taxes. And of course, that was ruled unconstitutional, so we wound up with nothing. I don't think it's fair to assess anybody in the rest of the Commonwealth for what our needs are in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. And so I very much prefer a regional approach, either by local option by the local governments or a referendum. Let the people decide whether they're willing to pay more.
Well, how about the way that the sort of, what is it, how many taxes were included? We had basic value-added tax added. In other words, you didn't raise the gas tax, which to me is a logical way to do it, the use tax. But we had this hodgepodge of taxes that went on. Can you explain those and maybe?
You know, I'm not in the legislature, so I wasn't privy to any of the conversation. I've read through the bill, and I think there certainly is a hodgepodge. I agree that gas tax is the most appropriate because that's the user's fee. And one of the things that I like to share with people is 30% of the gas tax is paid by out-of-state drivers. In Northern Virginia, we have tens of thousands of commuters from Maryland and D.C. who cause wear and tear on our roads up there, and usually, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes fill up at the pump in Virginia because our gas is less expensive than it is in D.C. and probably in Maryland. And so I look at the gas tax also as a user's fee. We had to do something different with the gas tax, and this is why. Back in 1986, when they set 17.5 cents per gallon, and they never have done anything else. So it has not kept up with the cost of inflation. And that's why we have a deficit in our transportation funds, both construction, maintenance, and operations. And so making a percentage of sale rather than a flat amount is important. And the reason this has happened is cars have become more fuel efficient and people are not purchasing as much gasoline as they used to. And the president has just set new CAFE standards, which means automobiles are going to become even more fuel efficient and individuals are going to be buying less gasoline. And so because of the way they set it up back in 1986, they did not do it in an appropriate manner so that you had any increase due to, they kept up with inflation. And that is primarily why we're in the position we're in. But I agree with you that the gas tax is the appropriate way to tax. It is very much a user's fee. If you're using the roads, you're filling up your car, you're paying for wear and tear. And that makes sense to me as well. Dave, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Going right along with the same thing there. Well, I understand the biggest problem that we have here is we don't set priorities. You know, I work in the public sector. I have 10 priorities. Okay. Well, how can you have 10 priorities? Well, what it is they all share equal weight. So, and I understand even, you know, I've only been here in Virginia for 12, 13 years. But I understand that the roads have never been a priority. They've always been mentioned in order to raise taxes. But, you know, and say, yeah, you know, we're going to use this money, but it was never a priority, so they always shifted that money into something else that they considered was a priority. To me, you know, we can raise as many taxes as we want to, but unless it is a priority, you know, if it has to be a line item. If it's not a line item, then it very seldom gets any funding, and then they use that as a jumping, you know, a place to jump off of in order to raise additional taxes.
Right, and that's a fair comment. In my mind, the obligations of state government are education, transportation, public safety, and a safety net for those who truly need a handout, not a handout. Part of the challenge has been that the Democrats, and we had several constitutional amendment resolutions that came our way that I was voted for, that would have constitutionally said that transportation funds cannot be used for anything else, just for transportation. It makes sense, you're paying gas tax, you're going to be paid for transportation. The Democrats would never pass it unless there was also, unless it also said the general fund can't be used for transportation. And we Republicans just don't agree with that. And with a 20-20 split, this becomes very difficult because the lieutenant governor cannot split a tie vote on the budget, tax bills, or resolutions. And so you're kind of between a rock and a hard place at that point. I will tell you that I have voted for a budget, against a budget in the past when I was in the House of Delegates. Governor Gilmore sent over his last budget and then he was gone. And in that budget, we had to cut a few $1 billion. We went through a mini recession then. And what he did was he took money from the transportation fund and put it into the general fund to reduce how much tax cutting had to take place, and replace those transportation dollars with federal revenue anticipation notes, which is debt. So he took money from the transportation fund and put it into the general fund, and then replaced those dollars with debt. And we had a caucus briefing explaining what was in this conference, because the conferees had decided to use that mechanism, if you will, too. And as I was walking back to the chamber to vote, Dave Alba was with me, and I said, you know what, Dave, I'm not voting for this budget. I just can't vote for a budget that takes transportation money out of the fund and replaces it with debt. And he said, you know what, I can't do that either. So there were about 8 of us that voted against the budget. I should have commented to more people, but I ran out of time. And so I think that that's a huge, huge mistake. And I think it is very important that we have a lockbox. Now, what my understanding is what they did in the language of this transportation bill, and it was the governor's amendments, is that there is a lockbox. And the way they do it is this: if any money that is now being generated with all of these increases is used for anything other than transportation, all these increases go away, and they're back to where they were before. It's their way, bless you, of doing a pseudo lockbox, but I think we need to make it constitutional. Now let me talk a little bit about your comment about using general fund money. I think it's very appropriate to use general fund money for transportation, but I want to break the budget down for you. 50% of the budget is used for education, mostly public education K through 12, some of it for higher education. The fact of the matter is our universities, I think UVA, a few percent of their income is from the state budget, the rest of it is tuition, so we're not really doing much in higher education anymore. Right now, the general fund per capita is back to where it was in 2007. So we are actually spending at 2007 spending now, and because we've had to cut $6 to $7 billion, I shouldn't say we owe it there, but $6 to $7 billion have been cut from the budget. And so per capita spending is back to 2007 levels. One of the things that they cut across the board, so they cut state aid to the localities for education. I was in Russell County a couple of weeks ago talking to a member of the Board of Supervisors there. They're very depraved. They have no jobs there. This man's on the Board of Supervisors. He's a principal at an elementary school, and now he's in charge of the bus service for the school board. Everyone's taking 3 or 4 jobs and getting paid 1 full-time wage. And he said to me, his state aid to education was cut by $1 million, and the federal aid to education was cut $3 million. Well, that $4 million cut to a place like Russell County, where there are no jobs and no revenue coming in, and where a lot of people owe real estate taxes and can't pay them, was devastating for him. But the state even did that. I mean, they cut state aid to education, everything was cut, mental health, you name it, it's been cut because there's been $6 to $7 billion in cuts. So let's look at where the budget is right now then. 50% is used for education. 25% is used for Medicaid, and that's where our problem is. $8 billion for Medicaid every single year.
About 31% of the budget.
Currently, my the figure is 25%, but you could be right, it could be more than that, but that's where it was 14% when I left the state legislature 6 years ago. It's at least 25% now, and growing. 15% is for public safety, and that leaves 10%. Half of that money is used for the rebate for the car tax, because what you're not paying for your car tax bill, the state is paying that for you, out of your state income tax. But that's $950 million a year. That leaves about $700 million in the budget. $700 million. Now, to build an intersection, to build an interchange is $125 million. To pave 1 mile of road is $80,000. So when you repave 10 miles, it's $800,000. When you build an interchange, it's $125 million. So the question then is how much money do you take out of the current budget? How much less do you do for education, all the other things, because it's about prioritization, and put into transportation. Now the governor, when he did his original bill, put $250 million of general fund money into transportation, 2 interchanges. And I think it's very important to understand how much these transportation projects cost. If you're going to repave 100 miles, it's $8 million. And so I think it's important to understand how expensive these transportation projects are. Construction is amazingly, horribly expensive. Repaving is as well. And that is our greatest challenge, is how much do you take from the general fund, and how much does that really pay? If you're going to do 2 interchanges a year, that's fine, but then you're not doing anybody else's construction, and which region gets it? And so those are the budget challenges that we have, and I think that we need to be very thoughtful about where we take more money out, because the more you take from public education, the more your local governments have to pay instead. And you don't want them increasing your real estate taxes, and so that's kind of the vicious cycle that we find ourselves in. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I appreciate your understanding of the budget. I don't
Well, it's because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a mathematician, so
Well,
what can I say?
I don't quite see it as maybe the way you do. When I see 50% for the education and 30% for Medicare, or 29%, whatever it might be, I see the 50% as being the problem personally.
Okay.
And the transportation, and I've been here since about 2000, transportation has had plenty of funding. It had funding when the gas tax was increased. It got funding when I was here. The money did not get saved. It got squandered. And now, where we're out of the money, we already spent the money, and now they're saying, give me more money. And I'm through with compromise. Through. I mean, I don't care what people say, how hard it is, I'm going to reach across the aisle. No, I'm done. Compromise that's been going on is like me asking you for $1, me giving you 75 cents back, and saying thanks for the compromise. I'm done.
Gotcha. And like
How
I
are
said,
you
I haven't been in
gonna
the
hold the
legislature
line?
for 6 years, so I'm not, I'm just explaining numbers and how much things cost, just to give you a kind of a perspective of where we are.
I understand that, the budgets, but I've looked at the school budget. I don't know, the state budget was too brutal for me. I thought I was going to put a gun to my head looking at that. But once again, like any other budget, I see areas that can be cut. When you say that the interchange costs $125 million, if we calculate that, one, I think, who's doing it, and are we getting ripped off? If somebody quotes me for a $50,000 kitchen, I'm going to look at it a little bit more closely. I'm not going to just accept that as being the going rate. And that's what we're doing, is saying that's the going rate. And one, are the Virginians working on that? Or are we importing people from Indiana to work on our roads, take our money, and take it somewhere else? We need to keep the money locally and not pay for regional issues, which I think, it's great that you look at it that way as a regional issue, and Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia. There's no reason why some dude in Farmville should be paying for Northern Virginia unless he goes up there.
That's right.
Who does those,
I
is it VDOT who does those interchanges, or are they competitive bids?
They have to do competitive bid, that's required in the law. But I will tell you, the reason it's gotten so expensive is because the cost of steel and the cost of concrete, much of which is not produced in the United States anymore. And I am a very, very strong believer in the marketplace and the free market. But I think when you don't have a lot of competition, and there aren't a lot of places to get things from, that pulls up the cost. But it's steel and concrete that are driving the cost of all of this. But they are required to do competitive bids. Yes.
Municipalities, towns, cities, now we have some states, California and Illinois, too, that are on the forefront of most people's minds, are going broke, filing bankruptcy. Oftentimes, it's traced back to public sector compensation packages, public sector retirement plans. Here in Virginia, VRS, unfunded liabilities, the estimates range anywhere from 10 to $12 billion.
I've even heard 17.
Yeah. That said, the private sector, almost to the exclusion of defined benefit pension plans, they're gone. They've all went to 401k, defined contribution plans. As lieutenant governor or as governor, would you support a position that the Tea Party Patriot Movement has long held, and that is that those pension benefit promises have to be made to people who already have 20 years, 25 years in? It's not fair to them
Yes.
to take that away, but would you support ending defined benefit pension plans and reining in at the state level some of the more outlandish examples that we could cite and have discussed at our meetings over 4 years of where compensation for state employees, setting aside federal, but specifically the defined benefit pension, we'd like to see statewide office holders publicly advocate. And we realize that you represented in the General Assembly, Mrs. Davis, an area that makes up a significant number of both state and federal employment. But would you publicly support ending these rather generous comp plans that are this 10 billion, 12 billion, 17 billion? At some point, it's going to have to be made up. What's your position on that topic?
My understanding is that legislation was recently passed that does just that. They called it a hybrid, and they grandfathered those that are currently in the system, but those that are coming in the future are moving to a defined benefit program. And
Defined contribution.
Defined contribution
So
program.
the defined benefit is being
Yes.
phased out?
It was called a hybrid bill, and it grandfathered one, and it changed the rules for those coming in. And they had to do it because it's not sustainable. What you hear is 11 to 12 billion, but I have been told it could be much higher than that because of things that aren't being counted. Part of the reason that our Virginia retirement system is in such bad shape is because they were taking money out of it to put into the general fund. After I left, never voted for it. But that's a mistake. That's what they've been doing to Social Security for years, and so Social Security is not sustainable. These are dollars that have been placed into this fund specifically for folks' retirement. And when you start pulling from it, and it's a combination of that and when the stock market started going down and your investments went backwards instead of forwards. So it's a combination of the two. I can tell you I would never have voted for a budget where they were taking money from the retirement system to use to fill in the gaps.
300 million, wasn't that the number that was?
Sounds about right.
It was used,
Yeah.
I think it was.
And so now the
But the
governor.
other thing is,
Yeah.
employees don't contribute anything to their pension.
No, they
It's
don't.
all state.
Yeah.
Now, how about you could phase in that?
And I'll tell you, it's a little different where I'm from in Fairfax County because a lot of the local government employees in many of our jurisdictions use the Virginia retirement system. Now in Fairfax County, they have their own retirement program. And so Fairfax County employees are using the Fairfax County retirement. They're not using the VRS. But an awful lot of jurisdictions do. And so what I'm hearing a lot from local boards of supervisors and city council members that do use VRS is, you're making us pay into it when you're not. And that there's an equity issue there. And it's also putting tremendous pressures on the local governments as well. So I think it is a very important issue. My understanding, once again, I've looked at that hybrid bill, and it appears to me that they've grandfathered those who are in it, but everyone that's going to be hired afterwards is defined benefit. I don't think, or defined compensation, I don't think that or contribution, I'm going to say it right one of these days, I don't think it was very popular, but the governor understood he needed to do that, and I think that's one of the other good things that he did. If you just
Why
set
not?
that transportation thing aside, he's really done some good things.
Why not popular?
Huh?
Why not popular? With whom?
Well, I mean, with employees, that's state employees. But you just have to do what you have to do if you don't want to bankrupt the system. Yes.
I heard you mention the word constitution one time. Two questions. What is your stance on the Second Amendment? And the other, our Constitution has been shredded. And I think that happens because of our political politicians don't know anything about the Constitution. Why not move to have all political candidates constitutionally certified by taking classes? But let's go back to the headlines
It's not a bad
today.
idea. I bet it's not a bad idea.
It's a great
It's a great
idea
idea.
because you cannot understand the Constitution until you understand those that produce the Constitution and all the work that went into it. But let's go back to today's headlines, the Second Amendment.
Okay. I'm going to do Second Amendment second, and I will do this one first. You know, I had the Virginia Bill of Rights framed, and I always had that in my office, because I thought it was very important to review that every once in a while and keep track of where I needed to be. And I like your idea about studying the Constitution. I think that's very important. When you're making when you're making decisions as an elected official, it's very important to understand the framework. Talking about the Second Amendment, I'm very aware that there are those who have been out just going after me and talking about Mayor Bloomberg and all of that. So I really appreciate you asking the question and giving me an opportunity to talk about it. First, I would tell you I'm a gun owner. I've owned a .357 Magnum and a Beretta pistol, and so I am very much a supporter of the Second Amendment. For those of you that are convention goers, delegates to the convention, my first piece of mail is coming out soon, and you will see one of my bullet points is that I support the Castle Doctrine. My daughter's father was away from home a lot, and I was there with the girls alone every single night for a very long time. And I had great comfort knowing that I could defend myself if I needed to, if someone broke into our home. And so I'm a very strong believer that you should be able to defend yourself in your own home and not have to worry about prosecution for doing that. If you break into someone's home, you're sort of committing a felony by doing that to begin with. So I am very much a Second Amendment, but let me...
That's one segment, but the Second Amendment was not put there necessarily to protect
I understand. It's a
us
liberty issue.
personally.
Right,
It's
right.
to protect us from Washington.
Gotcha. I completely...
And therein lies a big difference, especially with the movement to confiscate, and they're moving to bring in from all directions.
Gotcha.
So,
Well, I will stand here and tell you and pledge to you that I do not support registration. I do not support universal background checks. I do not support banning any firearms or ammunition. And I think those address your concerns. But I'm going to honestly, and I always stand up and honestly say that there's one area that I might not be in agreement with all of you, and that is at gun shows. I believe that everyone who purchases a firearm at a gun show should have an instant background check. Just at gun shows, nowhere else. And this is why I believe that way. If an individual, to me, a gun show is a little different than selling one-on-one. Because in my mind, if you are going to sell a firearm to another individual that you've never met before, you're going to meet them somewhere. Your house, their house, parking lot somewhere. And you're going to be very cautious about who that individual is. A gun show is widely advertised. And that we have gun shows in Chantilly in Northern Virginia several times a year. Washington Post has a big advertisement. You can go and attempt to purchase a firearm with a dealer. Have to have an instant background check. If you fail it, then you can go and find a private seller. And I understand that not all gun shows do, but there are 3 large gun shows that do. And purchase that firearm and walk right off the premises. And for me, that's a concern. And I'd like to share some statistics that the state police just recently released. Since 1989, when the background check, which the NRA supported, that when you buy a firearm from at a gun show from a dealer, they supported instant background check for dealers. When the state police started, or when we started the instant background check in 1989, about 53,000 people have been denied the ability to purchase a firearm because they didn't pass the instant background check. About 2,200 people a year. 13,000 of those individuals were prosecuted by the state police. So that tells me that the state police is, oftentimes you'll hear law enforcement is not, what's the word I'm looking for? Enforcing, thank you, enforcing the law. But our state police are enforcing the law because we've had about 13,000 prosecutions for those that were illegally trying to purchase a firearm. About 3 or 4 years ago, when we passed legislation that requires that the mental health data be added to the database, it has been. And what mental health data means is if you've been adjudicated, if the court has ruled that you have to be placed in a mental health institution, that information has been added to the database. Last year, 340 individuals were denied the ability to purchase a firearm because they failed the background check due to the fact they'd been adjudicated to a mental health hospital. And in that report it said that these egregious acts transpired in dealers' retail shops, at gun shows, and in other venues. Now, I know it's not a huge percentage, but it is happening at gun shows, and we're seeing that the state police are enforcing, and we saw that 340 people were denied the ability to purchase a firearm because they failed the instant background check, and they had been placed into a mental health institution by the courts. And so, in my mind, it's important to make sure that we're not giving a very easy access to those who, at a widely attended event, to be able to be denied at one table and go find someone else, purchase that firearm, and walk right out. And that's the only place, and I know not everyone agrees with me, but that's the only instance where I support it. I do not support universal. I don't think that's pragmatic. I don't support gun registration. I just think at gun shows, we need to have everybody, not just some people, but everyone that purchases there have the same instant background check.
We have time for one more question. Rusty?
We've had, going along that same line, we've had a lot of doctors, for whatever reason, prescribing just because we have a child who is more active than others, and they're given drugs, and these drugs, sometimes it helps them. In most cases, when they're not really ADHD or whatever, it ends up making them really go really crazy. You know, we have a lot of that kind of thing that's happening. And, you know, my fear is twofold. One is I've never gone to a gun show that I didn't get. You know, there's nobody that has a booth that I know of. Now, if somebody carries a gun in, you know, meet me out in the parking lot or something, and he's walking around with guns because it's kind of an easy sell for him or whatever. But you know, I'm afraid if we get too much into that, then it's going to creep into, you know, I can't even give my daughter a gun, you
Gotcha.
know, or
Gotcha.
a family member or
Right.
something like that for their protection. And you know, that's what I'm afraid of. Like, and then we have the doctor thing that you know, I'm going to say this. I got this letter, this information in the mail that dealt with my medical condition. Now, how did this company find out about that? You know, I thought, you know,
Yeah, HIPAA should
HIPAA
have
was
protected
gonna
any
be,
of that information. That's
you know,
exactly right.
and so, you know, I'm questioning everything,
Yeah,
including Common Core standards, is because what they're doing is they're registering every little thing that kid does,
Right.
and he will then be, then there'll be a decision made whether or not, which avenue he should go down. Should he go, you know, well, he's not smart enough to go to higher education, so we're gonna move him off into this venue, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And those kind of things, you know, I'm sorry, you know, I may not be the, you know, smartest guy out there, but, you know, I work very hard, and I got where I have because of my persistence.
Right.
It's just like the Thomas Edison thing, you know, where, you know, he found 2,000 ways how not to make a light bulb. The same kind of thing.
And your point about the mental health component and prescriptions, all that, is exactly why the General Assembly drew the line at adjudication for mental health institutions. I think they went back after I left and added if you commit yourself to a mental health institution. But we drew the line at institutionalization because then you get into gray area. Marriage counseling,
Yep.
grief counseling,
Yep.
and you don't want to go there. And so we drew the line for the court placing you in a mental health institution. And I've been to mental health institutions. I had 2 of them in my district, and these folks are they're psychotic, they're schizophrenic, I mean, they're just very seriously mentally ill. So I
Rick,
think that was the
you
right
had one last
way to
question?
go.
Okay, you mentioned Medicaid.
Uh-huh.
What do you think we can do about
Oh,
Medicaid?
I'm so glad you asked, because that's like my very best issue, Medicaid. Okay. I meant to go into it more, but every time Bob walks this way, I know that means it's time for me to stop. You're just so good at subtly telling people, okay, get off it. So Medicaid, this is the problem with Medicaid. We all think that what's driving Medicaid is healthcare, and it's not. 70% of Medicaid dollars are used for nursing home care. 30% is used for healthcare. Now, waste, fraud, and abuse, yep, we should be going after that, but that nips around the edges. Nursing home care is a really big problem, and I'll tell you why. Our population's growing older and older and older. And I don't think we should expand Medicaid eligibility. And even if we don't, and we shouldn't, because the population's growing older and older and older, we're going to see more and more and more people come into the Medicaid system for nursing home care. And nobody's really talking about that. They're talking about 30%, which is health care, but they're not talking about the 70%, which is what is driving the increased amount of money we're spending on Medicaid. So this is what I want to do. Should I be elected lieutenant governor, one of the initiatives I'd like to take on is to pull together a working group of conservative think tank experts in this area, providers and stakeholders, and create a model. And this is a 2 or 3 year project because it's going to be very complicated and very intense. We need to create a model of how we rein in long-term care. And there are several things that we can do. First, I've never met anyone who has said, I want to go to a nursing home. Most people want to stay in their own homes, and if they can, and some people are so physically ill that they've got to be placed in the nursing home, but if you can stay in your home and receive a home health care rather than being institutionalized, it's 20% of the cost. 20%. If you can be in an assisted living facility instead of a nursing home, it's less expensive because assisted living facilities are not as heavily regulated. And I'll give you an example of the difference. In a nursing home, an RN has to dispense medications. And an RN can make anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 a year depending where you live. If you're in an assisted living facility, we have set up certified technicians, and they get paid $25,000 a year. So when you look at the difference between the regulations in one and the other, it's less expensive to be an assisted living facility. Lastly, there's long-term care insurance, which not everyone can afford, but some people can. And the more that purchase it, the more the premiums will come down. And that needs to be part of the strategy as well. And we just don't have a model in place. I think a home health care market will develop the more people we have placed that stay in their homes, and the marketplace and that free market will generate opportunities, and entrepreneurs will create businesses in that area, and it'll take a little time, but I think that if we don't really sit down and study how we can rein in those long-term care costs and provide alternative solutions to nursing home care, Medicaid is going to be 30% of the budget, then 35%, then 40%, then 50%, just because our population is aging so rapidly. All of we boomers, whether we want to admit it or not, we're getting older. And so that's the real issue with Medicaid. And if we don't rein in the costs, it's just going to eat up more and more and more of our budget.
You mentioned long-term. How do you encourage people to buy long-term care insurance?
You know, I'm really surprised that insurance agents don't try to sell more of it, honestly. Everyone insures their house,
I beg your
their
pardon?
car. Are you promoting long-term care insurance? All right, he is the exception to the rule. He is the exception. There you go. But you're the exception, aren't you? I mean,
Market penetration right now is around 5%.
Yeah, yeah.
It's woefully inadequate.
The problem with that is that, you know, you get 100% of your money, it costs so much to put them somewhere, and so it doesn't make it, the government is like if you're a family and, you know, you're at retirement age and your parents are at retirement age and everybody's at retirement age, so there's not a lot of money in the household.
Right.
It's like you were saying, all the restrictions and stuff that has to apply. It's like my grandmother had to give up everything she had, which was nothing.
Right.
Okay?
That's right.
But had to give it all up to be able to go in. And it's like, you know.
But this is where we step into the abuse category, because you aren't eligible for Medicaid for your nursing home unless you've pretty much given up all of your assets. However, they went back and said that your real estate doesn't count. And so that's kind of created, that's created kind of a loophole. But you can't be placed in a nursing home and use Medicaid unless 5 years have gone by since when you gave up those assets and when you've been put in. And the reason they did that was people were just giving all their money to their kids. and then being placed in Medicaid.
Artificially impoverishing themselves to
Exactly
qualify
right.
for Medicaid.
And so I think that really plays to the abuse part of the system, and that's helped some. But my question is, where have you been those past 5 years? Who provided it to you those 5 years, and why can't you stay in that situation with Medicaid helping with, Medicare does the medical part, and then Medicaid does the nursing home part.
Yeah, the helping, the aid part of it is what's missing. There's no aid anymore. It's total, it's everything or nothing.
That's exactly right. At any rate, I loved your question about Medicaid because I was always on the health committee, so I learned a lot about it, but I can tell you that that's what's driving the cost of Medicaid. It's eating up more and more of our budget, and we've got to do something about it, or it's going to become so unsustainable that our budgets are just going to shrink down to nothing.
Well, we've also talked at past meetings, it's ludicrous that many Medicaid recipients, cost sharing, copays are $1 and $3 for many of the services. And for about 75% of the recipients, even that $1 and $3 copay is waived. Now back when insurance companies came out in the late 70s, early 80s from the earlier HMO models, we had $2 and $3 copays for doctor's visits, 2 and 3. When something's perceived as free, what happens? People waste it. The perception among Medicaid recipients is, well, you know, it doesn't cost me anything to go to the doctor. It doesn't cost. My point is utilization, which the insurance industry recognized. These models, these HMO, these managed care models were no sooner out of the gate than the insurance industry saw what was happening to utilization rates. They were going through the roof. So the insurance industry quickly, I was there, and they quickly came around and started raising these copay levels in order to tamper down somebody running to the doctor because they had a hangnail. Or these Medicaid recipients, many of whom will show up at the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning in MCV hospital stoned, you know, with a sore throat. It's one of the most expensive settings, but there's no copay. So I think along with what Mrs. Davis is saying, that 30% of Medicaid that is going towards the cost of health care for Medicaid recipients, you raise those co-insurance and those copays, and you will help drive down the utilization issue that is bedeviling Medicaid. Let's give Jeannemarie Davis a nice mechanical.